Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Rastislav Shutek. I'm the Executive Director of Platform for Peace and Humanity. And welcome to our sixth webinar in this series where we discuss various aspects of the conflict in Ukraine. Today's webinar will focus on foreign fighters on both sides of the conflict. Shortly after the Russian invasion on 24th of February, Ukraine created the International Legion for the Territorial Defense of Ukraine and began calling for foreign volunteers to join it. Ukraine claims that approximately 20,000 individuals have joined its armed forces from abroad. Russia has also announced that 16,000 individuals, mainly from the Middle East, are ready to support it, which presumably includes other individuals from Chechnya and mercenaries of the Wagner group. However, prior to Russia's invasion in 2022, some studies estimated that approximately 17,000 fighters from 55 countries had already joined the conflict in Ukraine since 2014, supporting either the pro-Russian separatists or the Ukrainian side. And while these numbers may be wildly inflated, and some reports indicate that the number ranges from early several hundreds to a few thousands, we have seen that the theme of foreign fighters in Ukraine resonates in the media outlets reporting on the conflict. In mid-April, two UK citizens, along with a Moroccan national, surrendered alongside their unit to Russian troops in Mariupol. A month later, Ukrainian prosecutors released the names and photographs of 8 men from the Wagner group wanted for alleged war crimes. Sometime later, the mentioned trio of foreign nationals was issued a death sentence by a court of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, which was widely criticized by many organizations, including the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm sure that this is only a fraction of the developments that we will cover today, as we have a panel with 3 fantastic speakers ready. I'm happy that today we are joined by Teun van Dongen, Program Lead of Current and Emerging Threats at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, Egle Murauskaite, Senior Faculty Specialist with the University of Maryland's ICONS Project, and Petra Dietrichova-Ochmanova, Legal Advisor at the International Law Department of the Ministry of Defense of the Czech Republic, and the Board of Directors member and Vice President of the International Society for Military Law and the Law of War. Every speaker is given approximately 8 minutes for an intervention, which will be followed by a round of questions in the Q&A session. Therefore, I invite the audience to leave the questions in the Q&A box anytime during these interventions, but also later. This webinar is also recorded, and the recording will be later available on our YouTube channel as well as on our podcast channel. I now pass the floor to our first speaker. Teun, would you be able to take us through the motivation of foreign fighters joining the conflict? What role do they play in the conflict, and how does the situation differ from other conflicts where foreign fighters appeared in reportedly huge numbers?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me, for providing me the opportunity to speak here today on what is obviously a very topical question. And I think maybe a good way to start is to make the observation that when people make historical comparisons, it's usually to underline similarities. So to point out that something that's happening today is similar to something that has happened in the past, and in that way improve our understanding of that thing that is happening today. And of course, you know, those kinds of historical comparisons can help us understand what's going on around us. But I think historical comparisons can also have value in showing us how two things are actually very different from each other, even though they may look the same on the surface. And the comparison that I am going to make in this short presentation is a historical comparison rather of the second kind, meaning that comparing foreign fighters in Ukraine today to foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq will help us understand what it is that we're dealing with. And the reason I'm making this comparison, of course, is that as was already alluded to in the introduction, there's this sense that there is a similarity there. And in this case, that would mean that foreign fighters would with far-right sympathies would travel to Ukraine, get combat experience there, go back, and then boost the networks in their home countries, and also pose sort of more serious violent threats upon their return. And while that analogy is understandable and tempting even, I think there's a couple of points that we need to take into account in order to right size this phenomenon in relation to what it's going to mean for the terrorist or the violent potential of far right networks in other countries in Europe and the US. And the first has indeed to do with motivation. I think it's by now fair to say that the motivation of the people who are currently in or going to Ukraine to join the war is much less political than it was before in Ukraine, but also in comparison to sort of foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. There is no ambition to establish a new social order or anything. I think most people who are going there are going for are going there to provide protection to what they see as a country that is under siege, and also to put an end to what they perceive as an injustice. There's also, of course, people in there who just want to fight just for the sake of it. There's war junkies there, and adventurous, and like any war attracts that kind of crowd too, I guess. But what I think is lacking, and that is something that was very clearly present in was providing in their propaganda about what the region would look like under a caliphate. And I think by and large, and by the way, this is not to say that the motivations of foreign fighters traveling to Syria and Iraq were only and exclusively political. I mean, there's a lot of mixed motivations there as well. But I think by and large that commitment to the building of the caliphate, of that thing, that new order that they were going to create there, is something that makes this that makes the foreign fighters in Ukraine very different from ISIS fighters. And related to that, there's also a difference in the mode of travel. Like, to this day, we're still dealing with the fallout of the foreign fighter phenomenon in Syria and Iraq, and part of that is that they brought their families along, or they came there with their girlfriends, or they started families as they were in Syria and Iraq, and I think there's nothing of that kind going on among foreign fighters in Ukraine. So that commitment to the region, and also that effort by local organizations to tie foreign fighters to the region, I think they're mostly absent in Ukraine. So that, I think, again makes it a very different case. A third point that is perhaps worth mentioning is that, and that relates more specifically to the far right, is that there's no unifying narrative about the war in Ukraine. Um, the far right groups in like looking at this conflict are quite divided about what to make of it. On the one hand, you'll have far right groups that are supporting the Ukrainians, and that may have to do with some ties or affinity that they have with Ukrainian far right groups. Right, there's very and then we're talking about very specific ties, like they train together, they organize these meetings together. So like they will know people in far right groups in Ukraine, and then for that reason, they will take the side of the Ukrainians. What also plays into that is perhaps a sense of anti-imperialism, meaning that Russia is this imperialist power that is repressing a white nation in Europe, and that that is something that as a member of a far right group you should fight against. So those are some of the motivations that explain why some far right groups like lean towards the Ukrainian side of the conflict. On the other hand, there are also those who are more supportive of the Russian side. And they look at Russia as fighting the globalist elites and fighting Islam, and also championing these traditionalist values that a lot of far right groups ascribe to as well. There's even the notion in there, by the way, that is something that goes more for those who support the Ukrainian side. There's even this notion that Russia is still like somewhere deep down a communist country, and that therefore needs to be fought back. But then those on the other side who are supporting the Russian side will say, no, Russia is not a socialist or a communist country. It's a country that stands for the same values that we stand for, and therefore it deserves our support. And given that it's so divided, there are even groups that are like staying out of this more or less altogether, who are not going to touch this. And so with the far right movement being so divided over which side to support, it's no surprise that there's no real coordinated effort to support any one of those sides. And I think that's also what's keeping this far right foreign fighter phenomenon from really taking off. And again, this is a very striking difference with foreign fighters in ISIS, and because ISIS is a group that very clearly built its success on that unifying narrative, which they very successfully spread in the propaganda. There was this notion of we're going to build this new state, this caliphate, and that's where you can live like a pure Islam, and in doing that, you're contributing, you're making like a heroic effort to contribute to this to this big project. And that is something that went down very well with their constituency. So there was this message that that really resonated with their potential support base. And something like that, again, is just missing in the far right discourse at this point. And I think we should also look at the agendas, the political agendas of the extremist groups that are supposed to attract these foreign fighters, because their position is very different from the position of ISIS as well. They have no intention to waste resources on enabling people to commit attacks that don't help them. Like a group like the Azov regiment, it can be unsavory in all sorts of ways, but they have no stake in training anyone to commit attacks outside of Ukraine, and therefore they also have no active recruitment effort, let alone training camps where they specifically train people to carry out operations elsewhere. And again, like these are obvious differences with the foreign fighter phenomenon that we saw around ISIS, where their recruitment effort was like a major part of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and where we indeed saw training camps where people were specifically trained to carry out attacks in the West. And finally, I think one important point to stress is that you have to realize where foreign fighters in Ukraine end up, which is essentially in a unit that is part of Ukraine's regular army. And so they're not looking for adventurers that have no military experience. They're even reluctant to accept people at all unless they have a very something clearly to contribute to the war effort. And while you can be skeptical of the extent to which they can weed out all these you can be skeptical of the extent to which they're able to weed out people with extremist sympathies. I mean, I guess there's not much more you can do except for check for tattoos or something. But it's not an environment that cultivates extremism. And also given the extent to which the Ukrainian armed forces are relying on outside support, they're unlikely to jeopardize that by making themselves vulnerable to accusations of having right-wing extremists in their midst. So I think for all of these reasons, the foreign fighter phenomenon in the war in Ukraine is unlikely to be comparable to the fallout that we saw from the foreign fighter phenomenon in Syria and Iraq. But I think that the fact that's still where our mind goes when something like this happens shows that it's still a prism through which, or a lens through which we look at this phenomenon. And so while the differences are quite substantial and the similarities are, in my view, quite superficial, that frame is still there. And I think that also shows how powerful those frames are. But like we should always be careful not to be fighting like the previous war. And I think in this case, that will require us to let go of these frames and look at new developments with an open mind. Otherwise, all our problems are going to look like the previous problems that we have, and that's not going to get us anywhere either. So that was my short intervention. I think I more or less stuck to the time I've been assigned, but I will shut up now to avoid taking up other people's time. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Teun. Thank you for providing this overview of the phenomenon and for providing the comparisons with ISIS foreign fighters. I want to pass the floor to our second speaker, Egle. We have seen that many states were reluctant to restrict the participation of their citizens in the conflict, but some Western concerns have also appeared about the potential spread of extremism in the aftermath of the war. Has perhaps anything changed in this regard, and how do states perceive the perspective of reintegration, and what does it mean in terms of radicalization of these individuals? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'll try to build on what Teun has started to talk about and expand into the questions that you're raising that I'm sure are at the forefront of everybody's minds these days. So first of all, regarding the numbers, the best available statistics to this day suggest that there might be about up to 7,000 people on either side who have traveled to fight. So about 7,000 for Ukrainians and about 7,000 for Russians. Many of them are rotating and may have left. Some have been killed, but basically between late February and late August, that was the best available statistics. Number than obviously reported, and one of my observations has been the very successful PR campaign use of foreign fighters, much more so, unfortunately, than battlefield use on both sides. So a couple of points I think are worth picking up. Speaking about the motivations, it's not only that these fighters are very different from people who go to the Middle East and North Africa traditionally. That region tends to be known for, shall we say, one-way ticketers, aka suicide bomb missions, quite often. And it's not only ideological motivation, but also the type of fighting that they're expected to do there. I mean, you could talk about, bomb planting, you could talk about vehicle ramming, but basically people are trained to do some sort of one big flash movement. Whereas in Ukraine, people are arriving, as Teun has aptly noted, to participate in a rather organized battle form. So the skill set required is very different. And also, unsurprisingly, very different profiles of people tend to be attracted. Moreover, even if we think about this phase of the war in Ukraine and compare it to what we had seen between 2014 and 2022, before this turned into an active and more or less conventional conflict, we would see quite big differences there as well. Because earlier, my apologies, earlier when the war was more in the gray zone phase, and the conflict was much less linear, both temporally and in terms of the type of action. Arguably, people who had already been radicalized and in their home countries, like let's say Scandinavia or Austria, Germany, have been on the radar as being part of right-wing organizations. Some such people waving their flags very prominently in very small numbers, however, did go to Ukraine. And then, especially I would say maybe in 2015, 2016, there were some notable concerns, but the numbers were so small and they didn't seem to result in the end in any violent activities upon their return, that this sort of scare didn't pan out. Now, these days, when the conflict is much more conventional, and again, we're talking about different skill sets, different types of people, the diminution of any extremist interest in the conflict has further subsided. So really, it is fairly negligible. And I feel also it is important to stress that quite a few extremist right-wing chats, blogs, notice boards have actively discouraged their people from going to Ukraine. So really, I mean, I myself have written a couple of articles about this, big scare in February and March about what's going to happen with foreign fighters that never materialized due to multiplicity of reasons. Now, to cover a little bit more in depth the profiles of the people who are arriving, again, that's quite different. I had done a big study back in 2019, naming the types basically that Teun has also mentioned. But now I've seen that this typology has changed when the war has turned active. And basically we are down to very, very experienced veterans. And these are not just fighters like before from Chechen wars or grievances against Ukraine, but specifically Western veterans. I feel like it's an interesting point worth raising because quite a few Americans, Brits, some other nationalities who have fought in their national armed forces in very, very unpopular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, starting from the early 2000s, and now have retired or been injured or disillusioned or whatever. These types of people have seen the war in Ukraine as a good way to sort of fight the good fight again and sort of redeem themselves, perhaps, join a much more popular cause. And quite a few people, these Western well-trained veterans, are in fact arriving in Ukraine. They tend to not join so much the battlefield, but the training field, and provide a sort of various tactics, advise how to integrate the unit and things like that, which are very helpful to Ukrainians. However, there's still quite a large influx of inexperienced people, despite all the weeding out, and especially early on in the conflict, that actually caused quite a bit of a problem because they tended to get stuck in a border area somewhere, say like near Ukraine, in Poland, for example, in training centers where they were unprotected. There wasn't enough arms to supply them. They needed protection, so the resources were actually diverted to take care of them. And when Russia bombed one such training center, it sent shockwaves, in the minds of these untrained people who basically, came with quite a bit of idealism and not a lot of idea of what war is about these days. But even for those trained, experienced people who have seen battle before, everybody is reporting that this is a much more grueling experience when you compare it to fighting in regular armed forces of a national army, because there is no integrated support. This is not that you're being ground forces and you have air cover and sea cover and big visibility. So there's a lot more responsibility. The stints are longer. The ammunition and just basic supplies are short. There's also a very big challenge of coordination between people because the units are sort of assembled, mixed. They don't have a lot of experience of working together. There's the shortages of communication technology and all things like that. So it's really very stressful and really, really grueling for the number of people who are there. So hereby, I want to sort of start shifting the conversation from what I'm seeing in the battlefield towards a little bit more forethought into the future. And one of the obvious challenges is that despite changing attitudes in the States about foreign fighters, the support system has so far failed to emerge, by my assessment. Between, again, 2014, when due to experience of foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq, many in Europe had adapted legal codes to punish foreign fighting. So that was the situation that people were facing in the early phases of the war in Ukraine. They were basically legally equated to people who went to Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, which was silly. But so now they're receiving different treatment in many countries. Many countries have even actively encouraged their citizens. Leadership has outspoken of them as heroes, and of course, there's always profiles, in the Vice magazine or some other glossy outlets. In my view, this is very counterproductive, and I had been from the very beginning, I had been an adamant advocate against such profiles because, again, it glorifies the fighting unnecessarily. It only results in outbursts of interest of inexperienced fighters. And while we understand that, we all wish Ukraine would prevail in this fight, and as soon as possible, preferably, it is really not the best way to help. And even Ukrainians themselves are increasingly vocal about the fact that if you really want to help, send us money or send us arms. We have enough volunteers, especially of the inexperienced type, at home. So really, people who read and get inspired by these stories and want to get on a train or a plane, that's not a good idea. So, and also that's just, in my private opinion, that's just not great journalism, exposing these people's faces and coordinates and whatnot. But yeah, so coming back to the situation at home, while everybody likes to point to their countrymen, especially once they get international attention as being present there, it's a matter of pride. It helps internationalize the conflict. It helps sort of keep Ukraine's struggles at the forefront of Western publics, because unsurprisingly, as the war drags on, the interest is declining and it's becoming more difficult to raise funds and to keep political interest. Despite that, these media appearances and popularizing the war in this way, these fighters, they're getting very little in return. I'm not even talking about the measly living conditions or poor financial support, but really upon their return, they would not be entitled to any kind of medical care, unlike in the regular army, any kind of psychological support. It's really difficult, as I said, because very experienced veterans have reported that the conditions are much worse than what you get in a regular war fight. Whereas again, when you come back, the support conditions are basically zero. So you would be relying on your private out-of-pocket compensation to seek any treatments or help, and to first of all even figure out what kind of help you might need. I mean, God bless those with an evolved emotional intelligence to understand that maybe this is PTSD, but it is quite likely that maybe not everybody is out there yet, right? So that is concerning. That these people are really helping the information war effort. They're basically being mascots there mostly, but there's very little waiting for them back home. And on that point, I also want to share that people that I had talked with who regularly deliver aid, who sometimes help such persons heading towards the front lines, really, unfortunately, the consensus seems to be that the battle impact of these foreign fighters is somewhat minimal. There's not enough of them, they're poorly equipped, and it's really a morale stand. It's a show of support, but really it's not your decisive force on the battlefield. And finally, again, why I think it's important to reflect already now about the aftermath of what kind of support these people might need. It's because, again, during the earlier phases of the war, when things weren't so bad, when the spectrum of people heading there was broader, and when the stints they were spending in the conflict area were shorter. Already then, people were reporting difficulties when they were coming home. They were reporting difficulties finding jobs, despite war in Ukraine being quite popular there already, because of this stigma that you are a fighter and you are not part of the regular armed forces. So what are you? The presence of, again, very few but very vocal extremist elements from a couple of countries have given a bad name to basically anybody who went there from Scandinavia or from Austria, and people who really were just regular middle-class men going there out of different ideological convictions, got branded together with these extremists. Also not very helpful. So perhaps now this stigmatization problem is a little lesser, but it's still going to be there. And again, issues just reintegrating, finding regular employment, venting all this really difficult psychological charge that you come back with. That's something that one needs to think through. And thinking even further into sort of the future, well, at some point, regardless of who wins, the war is going to stop, right? And the question is, what are you going to do with the people who fought there? So this might be sort of a little bit beyond the scope of the immediate discussion, but I find it important to keep these questions at the forefront. Disarmament and reintegration into the society of fighters has been an important part of basically every peace process. And given the ambiguous status of these fighters, it's really not an obvious answer as to what's going to happen to the foreigners who don't get killed, who maybe don't want to return home because it's difficult, and who choose or are forced to stay in Ukraine. Like, how are they going to get treated? The other issue is that of war crimes prosecutions again. And I'm sure Petra will tell us many, many interesting things in that domain. But the one immediate sort of thing that sticks out as a sore thumb to me is that, well, there is a legal way of dealing with these atrocities, but there's also not the only way. And things like, for example, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in many countries that have proven a successful way to heal the society after the war. Right now, very little thought seems to be given about how to start putting Ukraine back together after the atrocities will be over. And because of some of these questionable practices, the way that civilian courts are handling military personnel, the proportionality of sentences handed out so far seems questionable, and just the rush down this legal response to the atrocities, which are no doubt horrendous, it might preemptively close the door to other solutions to the post-war healing and reconstruction. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Egle. Thank you very much, especially for highlighting the perception of the Ukrainian local public on the situation of foreign fighters. I think that's often overlooked. We'll now with the final intervention. In the media reports about the conflict, we see labels such as mercenaries, foreign volunteers, foreign fighters, etc. And often it is Russia describing these individuals as mercenaries. But actually, the framework of international humanitarian law does provide a clear picture. Petra, can you take us through the applicable legal framework, and perhaps we can also discuss the accountability regimes that could be used in this regard? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. Before I start, I will just need to use an official disclaimer that everything I will say during this platform represents only my personal opinion and does not necessarily means an official position of the Czech MOD. With respect to the legal status, before I go into legal status under the international humanitarian law, I would like to mention or put into the context basically the term foreign fighters, because as Teun already mentioned, the term foreign fighter is quite a new term, but there is actually no recognized international definition. So the good question is actually, from a legal point of view, who is a foreign fighter and how shall we recognize that a person is a foreign fighter? And there is actually another quite still new term, foreign terrorist fighter, which was introduced by UN Security Council resolution, if I'm not mistaken, 2178, and that was specifically because of ISIS fighters. So we have here a mix of labels or denominations: foreign fighters, forein terrorist fighters. You already mentioned that Russia labels all foreign fighters as mercenaries, so that's another denomination as well. We should not forget that before we had here a denomination for private military and security contractors. So it's important to understand that there is no recognized definition of who is a foreign fighter, and if we want to provide a legal status of these type of persons, then we need to look into international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict, which provides some guidance in this respect. But interestingly, IHL or law of armed conflict doesn't operate with the term foreign fighter or foreign terrorist fighter. It uses the term as combatant or civilian. Interestingly, it uses the term mercenary as well, that's right, but doesn't provide any specific status for a person that fulfills conditions as being recognized as mercenary. So what is the legal status of foreign fighters in this wide sense who are going to fight to Ukraine? So we need to differentiate persons who are joining Ukrainian side and persons who are joining Russian side. If we look into the Ukrainian side, it's far more easier because Ukraine is because the information that Ukraine provides is more easily accessible than Russian side. So as I think it was Teun, he already mentioned that Ukraine Legion is official part of armed forces of Ukraine. It was established by a presidential decree, and it's a formal part of territorial defense forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. So members, foreign fighters who join this officially established Ukraine Legion are under international law considered as members of Ukraine armed forces, and for this reason, according to Article 43, first additional protocol to Geneva Conventions, their status is combatant, and they are entitled to directly participate in hostilities. From this status, there is a number of, let's say, this status provides them a specific treatment in case they would be captured by the enemy side. In case of Russia, Russians would capture them, it means that they need to treat them as prisoners of war. I think it was you, Rastislav, who already mentioned that from the outset of the conflict, Russia labels all the foreign fighters as mercenaries, and basically Russian officials still maintain this position that all these persons are mercenaries, and if they can provide them some kind of treatment, they can be treated as criminals. So they strictly reject that they would afford them the POW status, which is contrary to their obligations flowing from Geneva Conventions. Both Russia and Ukraine are parties to all four Geneva Conventions, and as well the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. So their rights and duties regarding this conflict are equally the same. That's one thing. Just to confront the allegation that that Russia is mentioning that these persons are mercenaries, that's very easily we can very easily confront this allegation, because Geneva Convention or Article 47 first additional protocol provides enumeration who can be considered as mercenary. And in fact, in practice, it provides a number of conditions that such person needs to meet. And in practice, it's not that easy to prove that such person would comply with all the required conditions cumulatively, because the requirement is that all the 6 or 7 conditions that are laid down in the first additional protocol all needs to be fulfilled. And in this respect, I think it was Teun as well who mentioned that there are absolutely no reports that that these persons would be motivated by some specific private gain, or that their remuneration or compensation would be excessive to other members of Ukrainian armed forces. So at least this condition definitely cannot be satisfied. Unlike on the Russian side, because if we look who is fighting on behalf of Russian side, and if we look into reports, Russia as well has already pronounced that they are accepting mercenaries. So despite it's difficult to search unofficial information, we have some pronunciation of Russian officials that they are hiring mercenaries. And I think, again, it was Teun who mentioned the mercenaries from Syria. And there are reports that there are at least 20,000 mercenaries from Syria coming to join Wagner Group to fight in Ukraine. And what is their status? That's actually a good question, because since in this respect we need to have a look on the status of Wagner Group. So Wagner Group, there are no information that, despite we know that Wagner Group is somehow supported by a friend of President Vladimir Putin, I mean financially supported, there are no confirmation or any sign that Wagner Group would be included into Russian armed forces officially. Wagner Group cannot be considered as organized armed group, because organized armed group needs to fulfill a number of criteria: responsible command, disciplinary system that enforce fulfillment of IHL. So the question really is, what is in case Ukraine armed forces will capture somebody belonging to Wagner Group? What is their status? The law says that that such person should be always treated as POW at the beginning, unless it shows contrary. So there is a number of ways how to prove it. For instance, the law requires that there can be a military tribunal, like in a field as well, and that should deal with the status of such person. And if the POW status is not recognized, then obviously there are some other guarantees. Of course, such people still need to be treated humanly, with all the due respect and fair process, and all the basic guarantees that are provided in Article 75 of first additional protocol. So, I mean, I think it was you, Rostislav, who mentioned the processes in Donetsk and Luhansk regarding the foreign fighters. I don't know if you mentioned that that basically the first sentence related to death penalty, which is absolutely, I mean, absolutely unbelievable, because I don't believe that they would proceed with all the legal guarantees that they were supposed to proceed. So obviously international law doesn't talk about providing death penalty. Now I can mention a little bit about prosecution, and then we can discuss more during Q&A. So what are the possibilities for prosecutions? Basically at national level and at international level. At national level, it's quite interesting, because I think it was Egle, as she mentioned, that there are some states who allow their citizens to travel abroad, but there are other states who prohibit them to travel abroad. So if such foreign fighter will return to their home country, such person can be prosecuted for illegally joining, for illegally traveling abroad to fight with Ukraine. And this differs in every state. Every national legislation is different in this respect. Secondly, such person may be also tried for committing war crime in case such person commits something that fulfills criteria for war crime. Then there is a possibility of international prosecution, because if a person commits a war crime, then this belongs to so-called universal jurisdiction, and that means that any state on this planet can prosecute such person. For instance, Czech Republic or Poland, I think Latvia as well, they already announced that they are investigating and they are searching for information. So far, I don't know about other countries, but for instance, in the Czech Republic, so far, we didn't have, there's no accusation against a specific person yet, but they are searching for information, and they are investigating possible commitments. And then obviously we have International Criminal Court. Despite Russia and Ukraine are not party to International Criminal Court, Ukraine accepted its jurisdiction, and International Criminal Court already announced that they are investigating war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crime of genocide that could happen during this conflict. So that is another possibility that may come in practice. And I stop here, not to take too much of your time, and I leave everything else for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. I think this is the right time to open the Q&A, and I'll take the prerogative of the moderator to drop the first question. Perhaps we can go in the reverse order. So my first question would be for you, Petra, because as you have rightly mentioned, there have been some investigations and charges of terrorism, participation of foreign hostilities. I'm especially aware of a couple of cases from the Czech Republic where these trials took place in absentia. So my question would be perhaps hypothetical in terms of lawfare or hybrid warfare, whether these trials can be used as a weapon in the narrative of the Russian Federation, because as we see, people or individuals, foreign fighters, are prosecuted for joining the conflict on the side of the pro-Russian militias in Donbass, whereas the number of investigations for potential war crime charges of their own citizens is, to my best knowledge, very low. So that's a speculative question, perhaps, please.
I'm not sure if I understood correctly to your question, but I guess that you refer to situation that was before this February 24 international armed conflict, when Czech citizens joined the pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk region. So that was a little bit different situation from a legal point of view, because they were joining a non-state party, and Czech legislation doesn't allow to join a non-state party, or there was actually coming new law because of this difficulty. But the Czech criminal code allows Czech citizen to join a state party, state armed forces, if such person has a specific permission from a president. And the Czech law was silent with respect to joining non-state armed groups. So based on the cases of ISIS, and based on the UN Security Council resolution, foreign terrorist fighters, and further based on EU regulations, basically that was not only in the Czech Republic, but in the whole EU, states started to prosecute persons for joining these non-state parties, and the legal base behind was the support of terrorism. Everything in this respect was linked to the terrorism. But now, in a case of Ukraine and Russian conflict, it's an international armed conflict. Two states are fighting against each other, and we cannot talk about terrorism anymore. So the situation is totally different. But I'm not saying that there might be case in future that if someone returns back to the Czech Republic, and it will be evident that such person had no permission from president to join Ukraine Legion, such person can be prosecuted under Czech criminal law.
Thank you, Petra. Thank you for this explanation. I will follow with one more question before we took the questions from the Q&A box. That's probably for both Egle and Teun. That would be about the theme of foreign fighters in general. So the theme does play some role in the narrative used by both Ukraine and Russia. We have heard that for Ukraine, this is done in favor of the internationalization of the conflict, while for Russia, the narrative is that Western states are fueling the conflict by sending foreign fighters. Is there perhaps a bit of a truth in both narratives? I'll pass the floor to Teun, please.
Well, 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 I mean, I guess that takes it into the realm of politics. I think, I mean, like fueling is a big word if you're looking at the numbers of people that are traveling there. You know, you know, at the same time, I guess very strictly speaking, you could say that, but then again, this is not a like we're delivering all sorts of support to Ukraine, and I mean if helping a sovereign nation that is being invaded by a major power is called fueling an international conflict, then yeah, sure. But then we should maybe wear that as a badge of honor, rather than as the slight or the insult that it is supposed to be. And I think also specifically in terms of foreign fighters. Russia itself is much more active in training. Well, I mean, when I say Russia, perhaps I should rephrase it a little into they're allowing sort of organizations that sort of more or less affiliated to the Russian government to train foreign fighters, and they have been doing that for years to fight in Ukraine. So yeah, it's also, I guess, like if Russia wants to go there, so to speak, I think it's also a matter of you know, the pot and the kettle. So in yeah, very strictly speaking, yeah, maybe, but I mean, yeah, look who's talking. I'd be inclined to respond to that in perhaps a sort of kindergarten level, but yeah, I'm afraid that's where we're at now.
Right, thanks, Teun. Egle, what about you?
So a couple of things. First of all, again, I think it's important to keep the numbers in mind. So again, the latest data suggests that generally there are many more foreigners coming to fight on the Ukraine side than on Russia's side. But the balance is not too dissimilar. And the balance seems to be somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 on either side. It's not 20,000 Wagner people. It's not 20,000 people from 52 countries. It's approximately 5,000 to 6,000. There was this big announcement indeed from Russia that the mass force will be redeployed from the Middle East, but it didn't materialize. They weren't able to gather so many volunteers. And an important distinction to make is that whereas Ukraine is being very, very selective in who they accept, I mean, I've heard statistics like 2% of Americans who are expressing an interest get actually accepted. Russia, on the contrary, is lowering its standards because it's having difficulty attracting people. So while there might be, by some estimates, about 1,000 people from the Wagner group, and most people from the Wagner group who have been active and sort of dispensable in the Middle East area have already been shifted to Ukraine. The growing number of fighters among both Russians and foreigners who are coming to support Russia outside of the regular armed forces are being recruited from poorly trained criminal elements, and really we're not talking like experienced mercenaries there, because that number is very, very small. They're just running out of professionals like that. So there's a really big drop in both morale and just the capabilities that these people are arriving on the Russian flanks for reinforcements. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we're going on with the discussion. Another thing that I felt like it's an interesting point to bring up when Petra was talking about, and when you asked her about, you know, the Russians using narratives one way or another when it comes to prosecutions. Well, an interesting Russian way of dealing with this is as follows. So people, Russians, Russian nationals, people who are joining the Russian side from abroad, basically anybody on the Russian side accused of committing war crimes has been singled out to be sent to active combat, so that they would have greater chances of dying and lesser chances of being put to trial somewhere for war crimes. So, you know, how about narratives over there, right? And humane treatment. So I just thought that this is worth mentioning. And finally, to directly respond to what you're asking about, so of course, both sides with international support are a lifeline to the conflict. You could say that the West has proven much more of a lifeline to Ukraine than Russian allies have proven to Russia. Because let's not forget at the beginning of the conflict, there have been talks about which way is China going to lean, and countries from like India, some of the OPEC countries, really they have toed the line very carefully and maintained ambiguity. Right, so international support behind Ukraine was thrown, on the other hand, unambiguously and quite voluminously. Of course, Ukraine would always like there to be more arms, more training, more international involvement. But really, compared to what we saw in the early stages of Ukraine, or even if we would look at other conflicts where the West has decided to intervene, be it Kosovo, be it, I don't know, Rwanda, be it Syria, where famously red lines were being drawn over chemical weapons use. It's been a long time since we have seen such direct involvement. And there is some debate in the academic circles whether this merits calling Ukraine a proxy war. There is, you know, the good old article, let them fight it out, right? That any international support just prolongs an ongoing conflict. So detached from moral valuation, if you want the conflict to stop, you should stop the support. So there's that as well. So I think, I think perspective is very important to keep in mind when we're dealing with tricky questions like that.
Thank you, Egle. Thank you for this thorough explanation. And without further ado, I'll take the first question from the Q&A box. And I quote, that's probably addressed to all of you. So would it be a good act or move for countries which have alliances with Russia to act in sympathy to support Ukraine by contributing foreign fighters? That's the question. Let's start again with the reverse order, so probably with Petra.
It's not actually a legal question, so I don't think I'm the right speaker to this. I probably give floor to my colleagues, and then I can add something in case I find something interesting.
Right, sure. So that takes me to Egle, please.
I think it's a rather odd question, to be honest, because I mean, we're not talking about some abstract entities like states. Like states consist of people and leaders, and if a state has expressed support for Russia or for Ukraine as a political stance, it is very unlikely that it would decree some sort of you know, counter move. Like and then also the foreign fighters who are going to fight there, they're not going there by state decree. These are individuals who are choosing to do so. So to take a simple example, if you were to take Germany or France, the official policy is that they are supporting Ukraine. And you know, while the support might be not as unambiguous as some would like, the French or the German government is far from going to send official armed forces to Ukraine's aid, nor is it going to decree citizens to officially designate them to go and fight there. Leaders have expressed support in some countries for citizens doing so, but that is unlikely. So if we take this example to its logical conclusion, a country that is supporting Ukraine would really not send its armed forces for Ukraine, but nor would it send its armed forces or people to fight for Russia. So like, why would countries like China or India or any other countries, which are very, very carefully sitting on the sidelines of this conflict, and I would question the premise of this question. Really, very few countries have expressed any vocal support for Russia. Most traditional Russia's allies have really, really put a lot of effort to not be involved in that conflict. So why would they decree any form of support for either side, moreover to Ukraine? That seems very improbable to me.
Thank you, Egle. Teun, your turn, please.
Yeah, I think like if I were to put myself into the position of a government, and I was looking for ways to influence a situation like the war in Ukraine, I don't think that like making people go there on an individual basis would be my my favorite option, because like one of the reasons is I mean there are several, I guess, but like one of the reasons is that like you don't know what these people are going to be doing there, and if they're somehow linked to you or are there as a result of some sort of initiative that you took, and then you know, like they might not respect like the usual rules of engagement. They may engage in all sorts of human rights abuses. Like you don't have any control over that. And so I think what like I think if you're looking for ways to support Ukraine, well, I think as Egle already mentioned, manpower is also not their prime concern. I think there's other more I think there's other ways to provide help that are a more helpful and be less let's say politically risky for the governments involved. So I think that option that they have and the cards that they're playing right now are the best ones that that they have.
And last but not least, Petra's response to that question.
Thank you. Yeah, I will just add to what my colleagues said before. From a legal point of view, I mean, it's obvious that states are reluctant to, you know, support Ukraine or Russia with their manpower, because I mean, sending their armed forces makes them clearly a party to the conflict, and I mean, they don't want that. That's understandable. And if there goes a person, if such person makes a private decision, then I mean, it's still tricky, but a state may claim, I mean, we did not, you know, support that person to go. I mean, it was his or her private decision. That's why, I mean, it varies in every state. The national law basically creates the conditions who can, whether such person can officially or legally join another armed forces or not. But obviously, sending armed forces, state armed forces, is not on the table at all, and I don't think it will be.
Thank you, Petra. And I'll take the final question from the Q&A box. We are a bit overstretching the time. I hope everyone is okay with that. So I'll ask the three of you to just briefly answer that. It's a little bit of a question out of the theme of the foreign fighters, but nevertheless, how can we predict the future of the conflict, especially its ending? Let's start with Teun.
Well, yeah, I think we're venturing outside of my area of expertise, but there's one scenario that I think is worth mentioning, and that also has still some relation with my field of expertise, and that is what I don't think is like really beyond the realm of possibilities, is that this is going to turn into some sort of protracted conflict where like Russia doesn't want to leave. They will have some kind of occupying force, but then they will also have to be dealing with some sort of guerrilla-like or sabotage kinds of tactics. I think like also the let's say the geopolitical setting kind of lends itself to that, where there's like borders to get support in. You'll have an army that is none of it's very disciplined, that is low on morale, that may lash out against the population in anger, which then plays into the hands of the resistance. My understanding is that some types of partisan warfare is already occurring, and if that happens, then that could be a status quo that could last for a pretty long period of time, and which also increases the risk of this becoming even more than it is now, a war among the population, meaning that people who are in that guerrilla type of resistance against the Russians will, for instance, start to carry out retaliations against people who they feel are working with the Russians, and then you get that kind of dynamic in motion, if that's not already happening. So I don't know whether it's going to develop into that direction, but like if you're talking about scenarios in which this war could develop, this I think is one to take seriously.
Thank you for that perspective, and just a brief answer from Egle, please.
Yeah, I hate to speculate, actually. I mean, one thing I would definitely say, it seems like we're in for a longer fight than anybody would like, unfortunately.
Thank you for that brief answer. And finally, Petra.
Yeah, I mean, I will not speculate either, because this is a question for military strategists. From a legal point of view, what I can say, and what is obvious already, is that Russia discredited itself at international level. The way how they, act, the way how they approach the situation. I mean, usually war crimes are during a war crimes are usually committed on both sides. I mean, inevitably. Some party has a better discipline, so the level is lower. Some party has poor discipline, so the level is higher, or sometimes it's even, a specific intention. So we could talk about it for a long time, but from a Russian side, we do not see any sign in terms of trying to, increase the discipline of their forces, or trying to prosecute, or at least start to investigate what happened within what committed their armed forces, and this is a very, very bad sign. On the Ukraine side, we at least see that there is this attempt, that if Ukraine soldiers commit something that, I mean, I'm not saying that there will be some higher punishments, maybe not, but at least we see this attempt to trying to eliminate it, or to work on it. But on Russian side, we do not see any sign that they would start to work on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra, for that answer. And since we have run out of the time, I believe that wraps up today's webinar. For now, this is the final webinar in our series about Ukraine. However, more discussions will be announced soon, as we are finishing the new division of the organization into multiple programs. And I'm sure that every program has some events in the pipeline. So please stay tuned for that. I would like to thank our speakers, for some great interventions and informative insights, bringing attention to the conflict in Ukraine from a different angle. Lastly, I would like to thank to our audience for joining us today, and I wish everyone a nice evening. Goodbye.